Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Debate continues to rage over Edward Snowden, who's been branded as potentially the most significant whistleblower in US history. He's vowed to fight any move by the US to extradite him from Hong Kong. It follows his revelations that US agencies gathered millions of phone records and monitored internet data in a program known as PRISM. Under this program, the National Security Agency, or NSA, and the FBI had access to systems of the world's top internet companies, including Google, Facebook, and Skype, among others. Mr. Snowden also claimed that the US had been hacking Hong Kong and China since 2009, and he accused the US of bullying the territory to return him because it did not want local authorities to learn of its cyber activities. So, as debate rages over whether Snowden should be praised or prosecuted for his actions, he told the newspaper, the South China Morning Post, "I'm neither a traitor nor a hero. I'm an American." Well, what does this mean for intelligence gathering? And to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined here in our London studio with Karis McClarty. She's among other things, a human rights and civil liberties lawyer, and will be joined by our studios in Washington, D.C. and Moscow a little bit later. But first of all, your reaction, Karis. I mean, the fallout in the UK has been significant. This was a scoop by the Guardian newspaper, and we saw the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, in the House of Commons a couple of days ago trying to justify Britain's position and certainly saying that, don't worry, we don't circumvent British law. First of all, from the British perspective, what do you make of William Hague's attempts to reassure the public?
Well, I'm aware that there is a GCHQ report out on Tuesday which purports to detail a little bit more about where the UK stands on this. So in that sense, I understand perhaps why Hague has come across as slightly facetious and smug, given the level of debate that has been raging from the European Commission to America and here, by coming out and just saying, trust us, it's all fine. And with that in mind, it will be interesting to see what the content of that report is. That said, I think that as an opening gambit, trust us, it's fine, is not really how accountability works. And when we are looking at data collection on a much larger scale than just, for example, the collection of data on particular suspects, which has to have ministerial authority, but wide-ranging collections of data. We've heard recently from the States about Verizon, the mobile phone operator, and all customers for a 3-month period, and all calling records starting in April were collected. Then I think there are more questions to ask that can't really be blithely battered away in that manner.
But it's hardly surprising that GCHQ would share information with US intelligence. And so, I mean, how revelatory are the findings that effectively we have Edward Snowden who blows the whistle in a sense. But one would have thought that intelligence agencies would have been, in years gone by, they would have been gathering this information. But here we are, volunteering this information on social media sites, Skype and whatnot. It's a matter of course that would be under scrutiny.
I think so as well. And I think that really is why it's going to be interesting to see how the US will argue that real damage has been done here when you look at... And Snowden and Manning are very different levels of sophistication.
By Manning, you mean Bradley Manning, the US soldier who was accused or was facing charges with regard to WikiLeaks.
That's right. Snowden's disclosure was very measured. It was on his own terms. And it was particular information that really those PowerPoint slides don't give very much information that anybody couldn't have already suspected. And of course, working together to fight crime across particular countries, particularly ones with such a special relationship as the US and the UK have, is not surprising. So indeed, I would wonder exactly how much damage could possibly be there, but it does raise other questions in an important debate, partly to do with the contractors that have been used to collect this data, the commerciality of those contracts, and questions really about what has been collected, what the oversight is the most important thing, what the scope of the programs is, and what avenues there are if somebody wanted to challenge that data collection.
William Hague made the point that it would require ministerial authority for any, for instance, emails to be read for more detailed information. What we're talking about is metadata, aren't we? Now, would you argue that is less important than this idea that politicians are spying on our every move? Isn't quite the case, is it? The metadata is simply who called whom at what time, how long the duration of the call was, who sent whom an email, that kind of stuff.
Metadata can, when you're looking at Google searches in particular, which does contain content as well as just times of calls and who you've called, could create really an impression of a person, a profile of a person that may be very misleading. I actually don't think it's really that relevant about whether the content or not could create an accurate picture. But just in case somebody did think that was relevant, imagine if, for example, you'd once had a prescription for antidepressant medication, and then a few years later you'd searched because of a conversation you were having about facts about recent psychopaths, and maybe a bit later than that you were in an area in which suspects of a murder were taking place. Would those searches, would the data that has been collected be an accurate picture? I think people who suggest that if you haven't done anything wrong, you've got nothing to fear, have a very naive view of what right and wrong is likely to be and what the interpretation of this data can be. But we have to wait and see.
And I suppose it suggests also that governments, states, don't make mistakes.
That they don't make mistakes and that they don't have political agendas that may be different to your own agenda. It suggests that every citizen has been given the economic freedom to make the right and wrong decisions, and that those right and wrong decisions are shared by everybody else at all points, and that everything that you say will always be interpreted in the way that you meant it. And I think should anybody have any concerns about this, then really they should also be looking at what information they've consented to commercial firms, to Google, to Facebook, having online about them, and whether they're happy about that.
But I guess it highlights, or throws into stark relief, who owns the information, and it is unclear. We thought that we owned it. We thought that we owned the information that we put up on social networks and things. The agencies probably thought that they owned it because they were snooping on it, but it's unclear. I mean, this has really shown that, who does own the information, who has the rights to it? What about the proprietorship of that?
Right. I think there has always been the understanding for most people that there may well be situations in which the privacy accorded to us by these commercial organisations can be circumvented for reasons of national security. And I think it's important that we understand that most people involved in this debate understand the need for certain national security measures to be taken. But this debate is about the extent of those procedures and the extent to which our privacy, as we believe it to be because we sign the terms and conditions by acceding to them on these sites, whether that is exactly what our understanding is. And I think what's very interesting is that at first when this broke, we were told to be reassured that nothing would be done outside of what was absolutely necessary. And actually it's come to pass that a lot of very, very important people have had a bit more to say about it than that. We've had the Vice President of the European Commission sending a list of questions to President Obama about exactly how his safeguards are helping protect the data protection rights, and you never want to cross European data protection rights. If you've done any business in Europe, you'll realise that, and exactly what these constraints are and safeguards are. The other important thing I think to point out about this is that there is a confidentiality around certain secrecy, around certain aspects of cases which are in the public interest to not disclose, and we understand that. Is this stretching the concept of secrecy too far and covering entire swathes of data? Why couldn't we have a debate about the concepts and really hypothetically what data could be released or not?
Well, it's an American story as much as a British story, so we'll cross to Washington, D.C., our studio there, for their take.
Thank you very much, Brendan. For Voice Russia in Washington, I'm Carmen Russell-Sluchansky, and I'm actually joined in the studio right now by Shahid Buttar. He's the Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which is based here in D.C. Let me also point out that he's a civil rights lawyer, hip-hop and electronica MC, independent columnist, nonprofit leader, grassroots community organizer, singer and poet, a true Renaissance man there. Shahid, but I do want you to put on your legal hat for a minute, because I want to take a look at the discussion. Let's talk about what Edward Snowden did in a moment, whether, the legality of whether or not he's a whistleblower, a leaker, or whatever, what have you. But I want to go ahead and take a look at, as Karis was just talking about, this idea of metadata and looking at the U.S. law. And obviously, they were coming from the British perspective, what's allowed there. the Supreme Court's ruled on this, right? Smith v. Maryland, in which they actually determined that things like phone records, they were talking about a pen register, in which the installation of a pen register to acquire very similar information here in a particular criminal case.
In a particular case.
That's
critical, right? Because Karras was drawing attention to the macroscopic nature of data collection here, which is to say there's no connection to individual suspicion at all. The U.S. Constitution has a Fourth Amendment. It's a central pillar of the document, and it says that we the people shall not be subject to unreasonable searches and seizures. That's what you can think of why that's important to the maintenance of a democracy. What that's meant in practice historically is that courts have required the executive branch to have some basis for individual suspicion before scrutinizing someone. And even just to pat someone down on the street for weapons requires reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, even if, police agencies across the country disregard that. The fact of the matter is that's the legal standard. And the idea here that the NSA has simply tapped the back end of the internet and the phone system and taking taxpayer dollars to secretly pay corporations to abuse our rights en masse is beyond the pale. It's preposterous. And the only time the Supreme Court's touched this question, it's punted, saying that it's not even going to rule on the issue because the fact of executive secrecy is taken as insulation from judicial review, right? Because the plaintiffs...
So, right, national security, right? But let's get there in one moment.
Yeah.
Because I want to ask you this specifically, talking about this metadata. I mean, a lot of it, the government's arguing, a lot of people are arguing, that this is not really private. It's not like reading our emails. It's not tapping our phones. We, you and I are, I think we're Facebook friends. We put up, photos and so on Facebook.
Sure.
We put it out there. It's not 1984 because the government's not snooping in our private data. We are actually snooping in each other's private data because we're just making it public. I mean, it's almost like there's a rush, to talk about.
There's a difference because we disclose to each other in discrete chunks, but what the government collects is not discrete chunks, right? It constructs entire. I mean, where there is a psychological profile on each of us, essentially, that the NSA can create based on the data it's collected. It's the fact that it's broad spectrum and unhinged from any particular investigation that makes it nefarious, and it's different in kind than when we, for instance, post photos of our social events on Facebook. That's a discrete disclosure to a discrete group of people, even if it is now, because it's on the internet, available to everyone. The idea of the government in particular, as opposed to some corporation, collecting it all and then having it available to sift through on demand is very disturbing if you think about, for instance, the way it could be used to restrict dissent. And that alone should make it unqualifiably unconstitutional. And the fact that this program's even been in place for 10 years, quite frankly, is a constitutional travesty. The founders of this country would roll in their graves.
Do we see any evidence that they have used it to restrict dissent just exactly as you've...
Well, the entire program's been secret, right? So there's no evidence of any kind. The only evidence we have of any kind was just released in the last week. So and to that extent, it shows that all Verizon business customers were monitored. The organization I lead is a Verizon business customer up until a few months ago. And so all of our communications were harvested by the government, and our work is organizing resistance to the national security state. Now, on the other hand, we're still operational, so there's nothing to suggest that it's been used in that way on us. But you can see activists around the country certainly interdicted and even detained by the FBI on the basis of their political beliefs. There are Occupy activists, for instance, facing terror charges around the country. And if there's one principle to draw away from last week's disclosures, it's that the NSA and the FBI work in very close tandem. So there's no way of telling how many FBI investigations have been triggered by NSA data collection, right? Or the extent to which the FBI's sort of program of contriving fake cases in the Muslim community in particular and among Occupy activists, to what extent that fuels NSA investigations. If those are the basis from which the NSA is monitoring communications, it's almost like we're poisoning the efficacy of the pool at the outset by generating false leads, right? And so there's a very disturbing connection between those two agencies.
You want them to have some, reasonable suspicion at the very least, or probable cause or something, right? I mean, because this is just a mass collection of data as opposed to this is kind of what you're saying. But let me ask you this is what you're saying, but let me ask you, is national security not a good reason to, for any sort of mass collection of data, for collection of data, there's been a lot of conversation, obviously, about the FISA courts, right?
Sure.
And about whether or not a lot of this should be made more public. There are actually now many members of Congress who are debating the same. Maybe some of this needs to be at least revealed to them more information, because we know that there were more than 1,000 government requests by FISA courts this last year, right? And they were all granted and so forth. And it's kind of a one-way. There's nobody there to defend this, but. Now,
which is to say, it's not a court at all.
Right, fair enough. But here, the reason for that is the national security. We don't want to give up a whole, we don't want to let the enemies of the state, so to speak, know how we go about these things.
It goes like this, though. That would make sense if we were talking about a discrete order, again, tethered to a particular investigation or a target, because then there's some kind of detail that, if disclosed, would enable the target to evade scrutiny, right? But when you're talking about macroscopic data collection, the Verizon order, for instance, that authorized surveillance of millions of customers without any limit. There was no granular detail. There was nothing operationally there that our nation's enemies could exploit, which is to say the basis for secrecy surrounding everything in the bulk collection arena is simply illegitimate. These are documents and orders that are kept secret, not for any legitimate national security or public safety purpose, but essentially to cover the behinds of the agencies and the officials in them who are conducting this unconstitutional, secret, wanton, mass-scale abuse. And one thing I do want to say here that's very critical is that Congress has absolutely been complicit. So if we think about the legality of these orders, it's perfectly legal, right, in the sense that torture has become legal in the United States, right? But it doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it constitutional, it doesn't make it transparent, and it certainly doesn't make us free.
Because Congress and the courts have said it's legal, so therefore, right?
They're all complicit in this executive aggrandizement. I mean, this is what the Constitution was written to prevent, and it is exactly what is happening under our feet.
Let's get back to that. I want to send it over. We need to send it over to Moscow for a second. We're going to hear from them, but I do want to ask you this one quick, just to talk about Snowden for a second. Yes or no, is Edward Snowden a whistleblower?
He's a hero and a whistleblower. Absolutely, okay. There's no question.
Now, however, does he deserve to face charges? Because, again, the Supreme Court ruled on this back in 1979, right, in SNAP v. United States, that the government can contractually oblige their employees to withhold, who are privy to classified information, to withhold it.
Sir, it's the same answer as before. It is legal to prosecute him, but these are political questions. And the fact of the matter is that what he has exposed is a far graver set of crimes than what he committed. And if anybody should be prosecuted, it's the officials at the NSA who lied to the American people and Congress about the scope of their activities, the full scope of which remains completely unknown. We've just seen tips of the iceberg, and Snowden gave us the opportunity for that. But we need more whistleblowers to come forward, and a prosecution adding on the Obama administration's unprecedented crackdown on whistleblowers. It's prosecuting more people in the last 5 years than in the prior 225-year history of the Republic combined, under an administration that claims to be the most transparent ever. And so another whistleblower prosecution is not going to help that record. And I do think that there need to be more robust protections for whistleblowers so that we, the people, the public, and the press, and Congress for that matter, can learn about these secrets that the courts and the executive branch otherwise conspire to keep out of view because they're inconvenient.
All right, we will come back, Shahid, in just a moment, but we are the voice of Russia, so I do want to go to Moscow and hear from them. Evgeny, Sukhoi, it's all yours.
In the studio by Andrey Komarov. He is head of international projects for IB Group. This is actually a digital forensics company. Andrey, thanks for joining us. Now, first of all, let's get to Edward Snowden's scandal. What's your impression? Do you think the scope of the scandal is similar to the case of Monica Lewinsky or Iran-Contras?
No, of course not, because I can say that such kind of incidents were also mentioned in some foreign countries, including the European Union. For example, in Netherlands and Germany, many law enforcement practice such things as malware and its installation in a specific way to the citizens. In many Arabian countries, the use of lawful interception systems is very popular, and I think that the key problem is in surveillance abuse, when their law enforcement use it as a mass surveillance thing, and lots of foreign citizens are also affected. Of course, it's a bit kind of scandal, but I can't say that it's something exotic and new.
Now, if we talk about surveillance, many people say it's illegal, although formally secret services have to get some approval from the court. Now, why is this issue so controversial? Why so many people say this kind of surveillance is illegal?
Let me say so that in regard of this U.S. incident, the problem is that all these services like Google, Facebook, Skype, and many others were incorporated in US, and according to their national laws and legislation, it's absolutely legal to operate with all the internal data on all the users, sometimes without any official legal statement, of course for national security purposes. And some other countries, the citizens of which use these services for like every day, of course they are quite worried about this situation because it's not controlled in legal matter. But I can say that there are lots of other systems, not PRISM, which is widely spread in the world, and more of them are connected with signal intelligence, and there are space intelligence topics. And in sometimes it's absolutely impossible to prevent the methods used by law enforcement. That's why the popularity of different countries, they should just be prepared for their privacy abuse.
You've just mentioned those systems, so are there any other similar systems to this PRISM system we're now discussing?
Yeah, the most nearest alternative is the Echelon and French-Echelon system installed in Swiss Alps. It's absolutely signal intelligence systems which intercepts the radio electronic signals across the European countries and some other countries where the US agencies have strong positions. And of course, not only computer data can be intercepted, it's their telephone calls, the records of our electronic devices, and many others. In legal practice, it's called lawful interception systems, and sometimes the operative departments of law enforcement use it in a bit non-official way. This is the topic which should be discussed on a higher official level, but I can say that there are lots of analogs of PRISM in the world.
Now, you've mentioned this notion lawful interception. So what can ordinary people do if they want to protect themselves against this lawful interception?
The best recommendation is to use the encryption for your messenger services, including instant messengers. There are lots of freeware and absolutely open sources tools which can help you to encrypt all your data and transfer it in a more secure way. I can't say that it's absolutely secure. There are lots of ways how to decrypt it or to intercept your keys, but anyway, it can help you to protect your privacy. The second recommendation is not to transfer the data which is sensitive in clear text or in plain text. Of course, it's always better to decrypt it or to transfer it not by electronic signals and internet.
Do you personally use those methods?
Yeah, for example, in our company we use encryption methods, especially on some sensitive things we would love not to discuss with like competitors, or sometimes law enforcement is very interested in monitoring private sector. That's why we prefer to encrypt all our communications, including cell phone data.
Now, let's look at from another angle. Imagine you are chief of U.S. security. Given the risks the United States have and given the modern technologies, what methods and priorities would you personally have if you were to conduct surveillance activity?
Good question. I can say that I would love to proceed in the same way, because their positions which provides lawful interception is very strong, and it can help you to gather the data starting from embassies communications to the private sector. And the good side of it could be detected by standard measures. It's absolutely transparent for the ISPs or private sector or cellular companies. That's why it's very useful and efficient.
And are there any methods to fight whistleblowers to prevent such situations as the situation with Edward Snowden?
By my opinion, it's quite strange that such kind of data about specifications of the systems were revealed, because it's related to secret or state secret data, which keeps in very special form, and possibly it's kind of provocation to the world that such facts were revealed. I think that we need to clarify the situation, and possibly a bit later it will be much more clearly why it was so and these data were on public.
Well, thank you very much. That was Andrey Komarov. He is head of international projects for GRPOUP, which is actually a digital forensics company. And let's now get back to London. Brendan.
Thanks, Evgeny. Well, I'm joined here in the studio by Karis Maklati, an anti-corruption and civil liberties lawyer. Karis, I just want to get your view on the democratic nature of this, I suppose, and what we have in a sense is an interesting dichotomy because I guess Edward Snowden acted in the interests of democracy, which he felt were being encroached upon by the actions of government, but he wasn't elected. And if it transpires that this information, and if Congress was complicit with this, which is what we've been hearing from the US, they're elected officials. He's not.
Look, there are internal procedures that whistleblowers can follow, and we'd have to ask him why he didn't go down that route, including, for example, there are protections. I'm not a US lawyer, but there are protections for defense contractors if they disclose information to a member of Congress. We could say that he indirectly disclosed this to a member of Congress in the same way that the US government are saying that he indirectly endangered or indirectly aided, they haven't said this yet about him, but if we look at the Bradley Manning case, they've said that he indirectly aided the enemy. I don't think that it matters really about the whistleblower themselves. I think that the point of demonising the whistleblower is not the real point of this debate. We should be looking at the wider issues that this brings up about accountability, about the idea that in the UK we've said, well, it's okay because you have to get ministerial authority. That's the executive. What about the legislative branch of our separation of powers? Where's the judicial checks? What are the ways? And I thought it was very interesting from Moscow there about talking about the ways in which we can protect our privacy there. Not one of those was a way through the courts in which we could say, well, hang on a minute, this information you've collected doesn't come under the public interest exception. How are we to in any way bring the rule of law into the way that these laws are being interpreted? And the rule of law, the idea of justice that comes above these laws that we're looking at, I think is much more of an important point. But the
demonisation of Snowden by US politicians, calling him a traitor and all this kind of stuff, and he needs to face the music in a sense. It's all about the idea of security being compromised, US security being compromised, that there's a number of threats that we have to deal with. There's terrorism that people need to be caught. But we're not really going to know whether he did harm or not for quite a few years, aren't we? And he's not in a position to make that decision. He's not in a position. He's a young guy. He's 29. We may not know for 10 or 20 years the impact of what he has done. He's taken it upon himself to do this. And US politicians have a point, don't they?
He's taken it upon himself to betray the terms of his contract. In that sense, he has gone further than he knew, and he has stated that himself. He knows that he's gone further than he was expected to, but he's gone further than that because he's looking to change a social system that he believes is not respecting the freedoms that it was entitled to believe, a system that he believes is working illegally. That is the responsibility of any citizen to make sure that it is, as far as they can, that they are doing what they are ethically comfortable with. It would be interesting to see what avenues he exhausted before he went to the media under few whistleblowing laws. Is there an exception that says, okay, you're protected if you go to the media? It says appropriate persons. It's certainly under our UK PIDA law, Public Interest Disclosure Act. But there are times that call for desperate measures. The information that I think that Snowden has revealed is very small. I mean, it's a PowerPoint that says that there are certain agencies, there are certain commercial companies that have been working with the government under PRISM. It doesn't say what that information is. It doesn't say anything that anybody didn't know, apart from perhaps the general public, and that's why this debate has become important.
And of course, centre of the debate is Washington, D.C., where we'll go to now with Carmen Russell-Sluchansky. Over to you, Carmen.
Shahid, let's follow up on that because I thought there were some very interesting questions and some very interesting points made there in London. But let's look at the U.S. framework here. Snowden, I mean, did he have to go to Glenn Greenwald in The Guardian and The Washington Post? I mean, is there not an apparatus here, right? Because instead, what the government is arguing is by going to the press, he's endangering national security. Why couldn't he go to, let's say, certain members of Congress? I mean, did he just not know, that was maybe the better route to go? And wouldn't we be having a very different discussion right now?
It's remarkably self-serving from agencies to claim that there was harm done here. And Karis is right, as I would expect. There's no operational details here. The idea that he's harmed national security, and I know the NSA chief lied to Congress yesterday saying that there's been demonstrable harm. That is preposterous. I mean, honestly, that's just patently ridiculous. All that Snowden revealed was the fact that programs exist. There's no granular details. There's no opportunities for evasion. In some respects, to be perfectly frank, I wasn't that surprised. We've known this stuff is happening. We just didn't have evidence of it. I mean, these are constitutional crimes of the highest order being committed by our own government, and it is very self-serving of the agencies to go after Snowden. There's no question that what he did was legitimate, and the role of the press. I mean, I shouldn't have to explain this to folks in the media yourselves, but the role of the press in a democracy is fundamental for a reason. It is one of the first rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights, right? It's in the First Amendment for a reason. The press is supposed to be the sunlight on the government to keep things like this from happening. And so the idea that the NSA, suffered some harm or that national security was somehow impacted, the only security that was impacted was the job security of the NSA chief and the other people in Congress responsible for this program.
Are whistleblower protections in this country not clear enough? Are they not sufficient? I mean, there is an outlet. There was an outlet for him, right? Why didn't he? Why couldn't he have just followed that? And then, so granted, I do appreciate, the way you extol the virtues of the press and so forth. But again, did he have to go make everything quite so public and make it available to, say, well, again, enemies of the state? Now, granted, they know we could do this anyway. But I mean,
yeah.
Right? I mean, they had a sense that they were being tracked.
When the author of the Patriot Act says in public that he didn't know this was going to happen, Snowden has performed a public service. Right? I mean, members of Congress have been legislating in the dark for 10 years. Even the intelligence committees have sought information about this program, other programs that the NSA runs under this agency, to no avail. Just earlier this year, the FISA Amendments Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, we probably even spoke about this on your program, was extended for 5 years. Congress had no idea what it was extending. These are revelations of what members of Congress have needed to hear. And taking this to a member of Congress, I mean, that's a very at least inadequate, and I dare say very evasive way to deal with this. I mean, what Snowden did is exactly what every other NSA employee and contractor should have been doing for the last 10 years, which is letting the public and Congress and the press know what is being done with our tax dollars, right? This is doubly offensive. This is a constitutional abuse in the first instance, and it's taking our tax dollars to do it. And it's amazing that in a time of budget austerity, even the NSA's budget remains secret. Mm-hmm. It's not like knowing what the budget is going to help our nation's enemies. I mean, this is an agency cloaked in secrecy for no legitimate reason. And there might be a legitimate basis for secrecy, again, in particular investigations or the granular operational details of, say, PRISM or any other program. That's not what Snowden revealed here. All Snowden revealed were very embarrassing facts for leaders of agencies and the congressional people supposedly responsible for oversight who have failed to do their jobs, violated their oaths of office and the trust of the American people, as well as at least the First and Fourth Amendments to the Constitution.
You could argue what he did was he just put a name on what everybody knew they were doing anyway, PRISM, right?
He did a public service. He's an American. And that is what one would I mean, it's amazing, too, that it takes a contractor to demonstrate that sort of public ethic that we used to expect from government employees.
We just have a minute left, and then I do want to send it back over to Moscow. But I want to ask you, I want to change gears for just a little bit here.
Sure.
So now Google has come out and said, you know what, we have not been participating. We are not we're not, collaborating with the government on giving up this information. Of course, they can't prove it because there's this gag order on Google, right? Because of national security concerns. The federal government has put a gag order on them. And but my question is what couldn't Google, Facebook, and these other these other companies that we work with that have all this information, what should they be doing? Because let's remember, they essentially, I mean, we sign waivers, right? When we sign up for Google and Facebook, and they say, hey, basically we give up our rights to privacy to no small degree.
They're monetizing the privacy that we as users voluntarily collect. It's very different to give a private company all of your information versus the government. Private companies can't come to your door and arrest you, right? I mean, the government has power that corporations don't, and that's one of the reasons why we have constitutional limits on state power, but not commensurate limits on corporate power. I would just say that Twitter is a good example. Twitter is a model company with respect to protecting user privacy. In very stark omission from the PRISM list. There are plenty of things that any of those companies could do to better protect user privacy if those were values that they particularly cared about. Now, to Google's claim to not be complicit in the PRISM program, The NSA could have hacked Google. It's totally plausible. I have no way of knowing. But whether Google has been hacked or whether the front office that does PR doesn't know what the back office that does government relations is doing, which is also plausible. I mean, who knows, right? But I do think the point here is that whatever Google gets, the government gets too. And
unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're running out of time, but I'll have to jump back in here with my guest in London, Karis McClarty. Just briefly. As far as Britain is concerned, I mean, it's politically expedient for politicians to say that they're keeping track to harm us. I mean, how do you think it's going to play out here in the UK in the coming months? We've had only 3 weeks after a terrorism attack in Woolwich in London.
Well, I think it's very interesting timing because we have the UK Communications Data Bill, which is going out where for the first time private companies will be instructed to collect information on communications made by their customers for no other reason than the authorities' future demands, which is something that has been seen it's mass blanket surveillance. And in Germany, Romania, Cyprus and the Czech Republic, similar arrangements have been found to be unconstitutional. So it will be interesting to see how this will inform that debate.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time, sadly. There's a lot to talk about. Obviously, that's Karis McClarty, who is a civil liberties lawyer. Also in Washington, D.C. with Carmen Russell-Sluchansky was Shahid Buttar, who leads the U.S. Bill of Rights Defense Committee. And joining our presenter in Moscow, Evgeny Sukhoi, was Andrey Komarov, who is head of international projects at a security firm there. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. Stay tuned. Now we turn to our weekly culture show, Curtain Up, where Alice Lanyado and Julian Gallant discuss the perils and tribulations of translation of Russian literature.